All right. Can you guys all hear me? Reasonably well? All right. Yes. All right. So I'm going to try to take something that could be a little bit of a dry topic and paint some light around it. My name is Jamey. I am with Finger Paint Marketing. So if you guys know Steve, you know Steve's been at Finger Paint for quite a while. However, I have absolutely nothing to do with anything remotely close to developing in software. However, I do have a background in public health, and I spent a lot of time doing data analysis, data mining. So I'm one of those people that love data, and data is data, right? Regardless of how we approach it, data is it's what we do with it, right? So I want to talk about Apple Health and ResearchKits. Before I actually came to Finger Paint, I was with Apple, where I did enterprise and business development. I'm kind of a techie lover nerd at heart. So if I get in the weeds geeking out over data too much, just yell at me and start throwing things. All right, so before we start, I guess I wanted to brief us with this idea that data is everywhere. It's just about everything. You guys all know data today is everything, right? Google has built their entire empire on data. And so I work in marketing, right? I do medical strategy, but as marketers, right, we try to convince people to buy products or to use products or to think differently about a problem, but we don't make a single decision without considering data. But data leads to new and better content development, right? So we put stuff out there, we figure out how people use it, and then we create new content for that, right? But as you guys all know, it can be incredibly difficult to convince people to change their current behaviors, right? If you look at Facebook, how did people use Facebook 2 years ago? Everybody just went through and read posts, right? Like crap you put up there. How do people use Facebook today, right? They don't look at your stuff at all unless it's media driven. If you don't have video or multimedia of some sort, nobody's interested in looking at it, right? Look at blog performance. It's the same way. Nobody wants to read blogs. People want to look at videos. People want to know who you are. They want to understand it, right? But at the same time, everything is kind of shifting towards I want to have numbers for myself. So I have a public health background, so I care about populations, right? I didn't go to med school because I don't actually care about you, right? I care about, truthfully, right? I care about something I can do that will do something for all of you, right? If I can look at data from all of you and do something that has an impact, that's what I want to do, right? It's kind of the difference between an epidemiologist and a physician, right? But today we all want to know our data, right? So how many of you actually have some kind of wearable tech, whether it's Fitbit, an old school pedometer? Wow. Okay, so we'll say a third of this room. Well, how many of you have an iPhone? All right, so you actually do, and you don't know that you do, right? Because, and actually it's really interesting, I'm a nerd, right? But a study came out that said the tech in your phone through the Apple Health app, when it monitors all this different stuff, is just as accurate as that $140 Fitbit you went to the store and bought on your wrist, right? And I'm guilty as charged. I wear one every day, right? Funny thing is, my phone actually pops up when I don't wear this and tells me I've walked 3.2 miles. I'm like, oh crap, I spent money I didn't have to, right? But essentially today there's this idea of a quantified self. There's a shift in this market, right? And health and research in general is a numbers game, right? So data is just about anything and everything, whether you're mining it, you're showing it visually, whether it's statistics, whether it's neurocomposition, pattern recognitions, video games, all of that, right? It's all driven by data. So what's the current problem with data? Some people would argue, especially Google, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the current data model. Yahoo, Google, and other companies have been basically gathering data for forever, and that's how they make all their money. So there's this idea that you and I go to Google, we punch in some kind of search data, and I get search data. Awesome, that's fantastic, right? Well, somebody paid for you to do that search, right? And that's advertising. Advertising pays for that search. So basically, in exchange for doing that search, your Google's serving you ads, and it's going to continue to serve you ads based upon the metadata that it collects, right? And everybody feel pretty good about what metadata is? right? It's whatever you do on the web, right? It essentially is going to come back, and that's how they collect it, right? But most of this data is being collected for a purpose, and it's not necessarily for my benefit, right? It's for selling to other companies, or so Google can serve you better ads that will result in more money for them, right? So when we think about advertising and those types of things, we don't necessarily have a positive feel about it, right? We're kind of like, all right, I can live with the idea that there's ads being served so that I can do this free exchange, right? But it doesn't necessarily feel really great. So Apple, right, steps in and sees a market opportunity, right? And that market opportunity is actually driven significantly by an act that the government put out a couple of years ago, how many of you guys know that basically starting this year, if your physician office doesn't use electronic medical records, they're paying fines to the government? Some of you, right? So basically, physicians and doctors' offices basically are dinosaurs. They live in the old world, and they have these massive file cabinets with just walls and walls and walls of files, right? Well, they had to convert all of that to electronic medical records, or they had to start paying fines. And the reason for that is because the government actually wants to start being able to collect that data for Medicare and Medicaid. There's also been the explosion in tech wearables. Pharmaceutical companies have been collecting data for forever, right? And they have their own databases, which actually are significantly better than what the government has when it comes to diagnosing healthcare, which is why pharma companies can provide better healthcare in certain ways than what our government or healthcare systems can do. There's also a government said, hey, we want to start thinking about how we be fiscally responsible. Paper costs money today, right? A lot more money. But there's also significant support for the Apple ecosystem, right? Based upon hand raising, most of you guys have some sort of Apple device, right? Even if you use an Android phone, maybe you've got an iPad, right? And it's important to note that Google and Microsoft have both tried already to do what Apple's now doing. All right, so who knows about Apple HealthKit? Who has the Apple Health app on their phone? If you've updated your phone anytime in the last basically year and a half, you have it. Whether you use it or not is a different thing. It was announced in last year, and it's bundled in iOS 8. And basically, if you go in there, you open it up, and you're like, oh, I didn't know all this stuff was here, right? It actually tracks how far you walk. It tracks your elevation. So if you walk up and down stairs, it tracks it. But the big thing around HealthKit is basically that, so if you have a Fitbit, right? I have a Fitbit, or I have the Up Band, right? So I have an Up app, right? I also have the Fitbit Aria scale, which does a whole bunch of other incremental data measurement stuff, right? But those kind of are like we're used to with a phone, right? Like we go into this app and we get this information. We go into this app and we get this information. And what HealthKit was basically aimed to do was to help take those silos of data and bring them together so that those apps could start talking to one another, right? So it gives a really cool cross-app, cross-platform ability to share this health information and data. But one of the early features was basically that it could integrate with certain EMR systems, so you could share all of your information with your physician if they were using this type of system. Which was neat, but it was kind of more, like HealthKit was more for my benefit, right? And if you guys recall, basically, was it last week or the week before, did anybody watch the Apple event? Anybody, any super nerds that sit in front of their computer and we watch I'm one of these super nerds, so I'm not offending people, but right. So ResearchKit, if you looked at everything that was announced, I watched, you knew about it, right? But ResearchKit was probably the actual biggest thing that got announced in all of that, right? But basically, this is the app, and if you go in here, this is what it looks like. It tracks your calories burned. It'll pull your sleep. And you actually have an emergency card on there that you can access from your lock screen. So if you ever got in an accident and somebody pulled out your phone, if you had this information pre-filled out, they could actually get it, right? Which is pretty cool. And it also integrates with Passbook, so you can quickly pull this content up. And then ResearchKit was really the big thing, and it was really the thing that supports the whole need for why you need an iWatch, right? So you can't go buy an iWatch and use it if you don't have an iPhone, right? Not an accident. But what's really cool is that this is actually an open source platform, right? So if you've been involved in any kind of HIT or healthcare, you immediately go to this idea of what about HIPAA and these types of things, right? Like what's really going to happen with all this health data, right? Because everybody today talks about what? Privacy, right? Like how can I guard my data? How can I use my data? And that's really going to dictate the success of these platforms. But ResearchKit basically takes all these different inputs, and now it doesn't only, so not only does it do what HealthKit did where it lets all these apps talk together, it takes specific apps that will monitor what you do, and then it will send that information back to some research group. So whether it's, the University of Rochester has one, there's Mayo Clinic has one, there's a bunch of different people that have already started doing this, but you can do all this data, and I'll give a really good example because there's one called Empower, and it's pretty powerful, the type of impact it could have on healthcare. But it creates a bridge between the data that I have on my phone, right, because that data lives locally until I agree that I'm going to transmit it to them. And it basically creates a common platform. So research is incredibly expensive in healthcare, but it provides a way that people can reach out and they have a whole ecosystem of users that are already using this platform that they can quickly build the tool, like the app, they need to collect the data, and the whole back-end structure is already supported by Apple, right? So, and I think that'll start to make more sense when I walk you through Empower real quick. But basically, these are the launch partners, and this just launched a few days ago. Stanford University is doing one that's going to track your heart, cardio health. You've got a breast cancer one, asthma health, which is huge. It can actually monitor the types of things that trigger asthma attacks. Parkinson's Empower is the one that I'm going to talk about real quick, and then glucose success. But you can say it's kind of a who's who's already starting to build into this platform. But Empower is really cool. Does anybody in this room know anybody with Parkinson's disease? It's pretty awful, right? It's one of those things that impacts your life. I did during graduate school. Who's heard of 23andMe? Right, people know about this. So the premise of that is you can do a sputum sample. So you spit in a tube, you send it back, and they can do a DNA screening essentially against markers of your DNA, and they can tell you what your risks are for basically developing something solely based on genetics, right? It's not a guarantee. It's just here's your percentage relative to other people of your similar genetic composition, right? So I'm Western European descent. It's comparing me to those people. But the two big things there that they make you have to go through consent and unlock and make sure you understand what you're reading are Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because there's no treatment for those things, right? That will impact the rest of your life. So there's this Sage Biotech basically came out with this app called Empower that can use ResearchKit, and it's running in the background in real time all the time, and it helps collect all kinds of information about what people do. So with Parkinson's, people have tremors, right? And it can monitor what's happening, what their actual activity levels are in those tremors throughout different periods of the day based on different activities. And there's actual questionnaires so they can answer it, like this is what I did at this time of the day. So this is data that when patients aren't in a hospital, right, when you're not sitting in front of me as a researcher or physician, I can collect this information when you're out and about in the world. So no longer is your iPhone just a phone, right? It's becoming something that helps healthcare make better decisions. It helps develop better drugs. It helps develop better healthcare systems. But it's using all those sensors that are built right in the phone to track that, and then it sends all that data back to them. So obviously, what are the concerns about this type of stuff, right? This group probably feels pretty comfortable with these types of ideas, but not everybody does, right? So it's what really happens with this data. So I actually had a really interesting conversation. This might be more of an ethical, moral conversation than it really is one about tech, right? But it comes back to, if you look at Europe and you look at the way that Europeans feel about sharing their health information, right? There's I'm going to use the word socialist, but I don't mean it in the classic usage of it, right? People feel much more inclined, because they're much smaller nations, right? They feel much more inclined that I am happy to give my health data if it's for the better good, right? Just like certain countries pay more tax and they're like, I'm fine with it because we're all happier for it, right? As Americans, we are one of the countries in the world that are just like, we think people are watching us all the time. Maybe they are, right? But certain people, there's a social element to this, that we think of our healthcare data as ours, the same way that I think of my genetic code as mine, right? And there will be a shift that will occur over time, but how quickly that shift occurs will determine how successful these platforms become. But it's a few things. It's that privacy, right? That's going to be the biggest hurdle to convincing people that this data is safe and that it won't be used against you, whether that be insurance or whatever it may be. Will end users, right, people who aren't physicians, researchers, know what the hell to do with this data when they have it, right? So I've got all this information. What does it mean, right? End user selection bias. So it's suffice to say that this is a socioeconomic issue where people that have iPhones and can afford to have iPhones are probably a different caliber of people than tend to get certain diseases or illnesses, right? And that's in public health. One of the things we spend a ton of time on are who are the people that end up actually getting these things. This data is not being sold to anybody. So your data is actually your data unless you agree to give it to somebody else. HIPAA interpretation. So for those of you in healthcare, HIPAA is huge, right? It's, okay, so we have all this data, whose is it, and what can we do with it? And then there's the element of, because this is what I do all day, is deal with FDA regulations, is what is actually considered fitness data and what is considered medical data, right? The FDA has come out and basically said if it's there are certain rules about when it's considered a medical device, and if it becomes considered a medical device, it has to become FDA approved. So for a long time, that was a big hurdle. So the reason the iWatch has taken as long as it's taken to get here is because there's been a lot of backroom negotiations over this not having to go through and be approved by the FDA for all that it can do. And that will continue to be a big thing of, are these considered medical devices? And then, from a pure infrastructure perspective, is where do we put all this stuff? This generates terabytes and terabytes of data very, very quickly. But the positives, right? So this is the potential wins in all this, is that we're in control of our health data, right? So who knows what their blood type is? Maybe half, and that's actually pretty good, right? Most people don't know what their blood type is. If you got in a car accident tomorrow and you're bleeding out and the guy asks you what's your blood type, most of us are going to go, I don't know, right? This type of stuff actually allows for it. In your health app, already on your phone, you can put that in there, and when a paramedic shows up on the scene, they can pull that up and they know, right? And that's the type of stuff that these platforms can change. So researchers and physicians, right? And I mean this in the most positive way. I want you to live, but nobody cares about you, right? So the best decisions come from looking at population level data, and these types of platforms help physicians and researchers get that data. And when you have that data, it lets you say, okay, now we notice all these things and they're tied to these behaviors. People that do these things have this outcome, right? So you can design drugs better, you can design surgical procedures so they're more effective. We can look at the behaviors of people that recover from surgeries most quickly, right? Imagine being able to say, if people actually did this and didn't do anything for 2 days, but then they started walking on the third day, that's going to lead to the best outcomes, right? That's the data we can get from a platform like this. And it's data for a common good. So all of this data, Apple has made open source. They're not keeping it, they're not holding on to it. It's basically being put out there so that people can use it and make it for a better good. And that was basically the reason that Google and Microsoft previously failed at this, was because they held on to all that data. All right. So hopefully that was a crash course into how we think about some of those things. Does anybody have questions? Yes.
So taking up the privacy question,
yep.
to what extent is the data scrubbed before
So as I understand it, with
Repeat the
Reese,
question.
what's that?
Repeat the question.
Okay, yeah. So the question is, how scrubbed is the data before it goes from me to whoever's in this research arm? And actually, it's a very good question, because this is one of the big ethical, moral things here, is who owns that data, and can I pick and choose which data I want to transmit? Okay, so say for example, I went to Michigan State for undergrad, and I really don't like the University of Michigan. Okay, and Michigan State puts out an app, and I could pick that I want to send my data to Michigan State, but I don't want to send it to Michigan, right? And it's a silly thing, but it's a great example of people being able to decide, right? If we don't have, and actually, you guys all know South by Southwest, right? That happens in Austin. So they just had a huge discussion. One of the big topics down there was this very thing, is about if we don't give all of the data, how good is the data really, right? So the debate is there a button when you go on your phone and you're like, transmit data, and that's it, right? You don't have a choice about what goes. Or can you go in there and can you say, I want to send this, but not this, right? That becomes very impactful. So I think where you're going is,
My concern is that to quickly identify that information that can be misused for any number of purposes to like improve the government in an inappropriate ways to law enforcement at time, to insurance, to employers, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Certain things that they don't like, certain files.
so it doesn't transmit your name, right? So it's not, right, no. So it's not tied, right? I couldn't go into that database and know that it was me, right? It basically scrubs off and you get a number, right? You just become data, you're raw data, right? But as of today, and this could change, that data lives on whoever's collecting its servers. Okay, so if this study is being done by Stanford, right, it's living on Stanford servers or whoever Stanford uses to support their servers, right? It cannot be put, and there's regulations that Apple mandates around what those servers need to be to put that data on it, right? Those people cannot back that data up to iCloud, right? So they can't put that data in iCloud. You can if you back up that data to iCloud, right? So is it potentially vulnerable if somebody hacked it? Yes, but it's the same premise as your phone, right, with the fingerprint scanner, right? So when you put your finger on the fingerprint scanner, it's not actually saving a compiled version of your fingerprint, right? It strips it down to raw data, and you would have to have Apple's algorithm to recombine that data into an image. So is it possible? Yes. But here's the thing to remember, okay? Can your house be broken into? Yeah. How hard is it for somebody to walk to your doctor's office with a simple key lock, walk in there and take your data? Right? They're not in locked file cabinets all day every night. Right? There's certain rules about being in a space where it's in a concealed room, right? But that data is actually already pretty darn vulnerable. Probably more vulnerable than we realize it, right? It's just such a hot button topic about online media, online storage of personal information, right? But that information isn't meant to be identifiable, right? But could somebody, if you backed it up in iCloud, could somebody potentially identify that it was yours? Maybe. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
You say that it's open source, so is it how the data is presented and how we want to do with it? Is that open source?
So
an API to interact with it?
Yeah, so it's the code of the software that supports the infrastructure of it, right? So it's not my data that's open source, right? It's the backend, and really it's kind of like a pseudo open source, right? Because it's not cross-platform. People couldn't take it and build an Android app with it, right? It's specific to iOS. But what people could do, what they talked about at South by Southwest was basically you could, if you're a security analyst and you wanted to go in there and poke at how easy would it be for me to possibly extract information out of here during the transmission between my phone and Apple, or between my phone and Stanford, right? And Apple actually has protocols in place around security and the encryption levels that have to be in place to do that, right? But it's meant more to poke at that stuff, right? Because the obvious question is, how safe is this stuff? So if security groups go in there and they find, hey, we can break it, they could submit that to Apple and they could go fix it, right? So it's meant to be a comfort for people more than it is really to be like, I can go in and develop parts of this software that don't really exist yet. So.
I didn't understand what you said, so I can repeat it and see if I can get it right.
Yep.
Open source usually means that if I was a security analyst and I found a fraud in it, I have to code, replace that code with something that's secure, and I can make that publicly available. Yeah, people can do that. So that's typically an open source license.
Yep.
And also, I think you mentioned that way, if it's open source, and I would Android developer, I can use that and figure it out and make whatever modifications to run operating system.
Yep.
So it's the license and all that, that technology such that fix something that's broken and make it available, or a new version based on that technology that makes operating system or
So I don't actually know, right? I suspect, right? So obviously, right? So part of these platforms, right, are a feel good, right? We're doing it for the common good. Part of it is because we know a platform like this will help us sell iWatches, right? But I think Apple also knows that of all the companies in the world, if that there could be privacy issues that would be front page of the newspaper, it's Apple, right? If iCloud gets hacked, and it's happened, right, everybody hears about it, right? If Cisco networks gets hacked, we don't hear about that unless we're kind of in that space and we know about it, right? What exactly Apple has intended for or intends to do with that open licensing, I'm not sure, right? I think to their mind, right, it would be that the code is out there, right? They're not hiding the code. It's not a secret. They want people to be able to go poke at it. And typically Apple provides very good alpha, beta developer feedback avenues to provide that feedback. So I would assume that would be the intended purpose of that. Oh, I don't know that. Oh, right. Yeah, I have no idea.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Max and back.
Do you know if Apple has to allow recording data from other like silos or Apple or whatever else you have to migrate to
Repeat the question.
All right, so the question is, does Apple have any intention potentially of being able to allow migration of data from other watch-like devices? So he said Pebble as an example, right? Are most of you guys familiar with Pebble? It's like they're doing e-ink now, or they were doing e-ink, or it's LCDs, I can't remember which. Not that I would imagine, right? Just because Apple never, I truthfully have no idea, right? But I would imagine that Apple wouldn't do something like that because that would be a conflict of doing that. However, where there could be a back end of interest, right, and this is another thing they talked about at South by Southwest, is would they allow at some point for, say if Google develops a platform, right? Would they allow someone like Google who could build an app for both devices to feed a common data source, right? And I think that could be a best case scenario, right? Because if we're selecting only for people that have iOS devices, we have a selection bias, right? And when you start looking at data, you look for where your data is being biased. You immediately go, we've only selected for a very particular group of people, right? Who uses iPhones? Higher income, higher education, Caucasian, Western European, most likely, right? And you get into these things, and it's like, yes, you can make extrapolations from that data, but ultimately, you need to be able to reach across a lot larger groups and more platforms, and it'll be interesting to see that dynamic as the platform grows. So.
All right, great.
All right, great.